Alright, so I'm making this genetics video for you all, and I'm going to do a little bit of a review in this video and also some context of where this fits in with what you already know about biology and how the world works. And this is really kind of our last unit, so let me just give you a little quick rundown of really what we're going to talk about here. So in our genetics video today, what we're really going to kind of talk about are types of reproduction, some basic terminology, so words, definitions, things that you need to start committing to memory now, so that when we start building upon them, you do not get lost or confused. This is a vocab heavy unit that requires you to have basic understanding of these words before we start stringing them together in sentences to make predictions. And really that's all what genetics is about. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So types of reproduction, terminology, a little bit of history, and maybe hopefully we'll get to some pedigrees, but really those pedigrees are all about what we call Mendelian genetics as opposed to non-Mendelian genetics, which is really where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we'll talk a little bit more about these, and then we eventually will get to some genetic technologies and how we do some more complex, oh, I miswrote here, so not pedigree, sorry, Punnett squares. And then we'll get to some things called pedigrees, which are a little bit more of an applied Punnett square. And some sex linkage and karyotypes and some all kinds of really kind of interesting things, but we need to get our basics down first. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I've done is rewritten a basic flow chart here of natural selection, right? So we've got our variation over production leading to competition, and when there's changes in the environment and there's over a carrying capacity value of the number of organisms, there's going to be competition over those resources. And those that can outcompete others when they have a genetic, this is key, a genetic adaptation, something that's biologically different because of their DNA, which allows them to survive. They would be able to pass down that DNA through reproduction and influence the next generation. And that's how evolution happens, right? Evolution is whole groups of populations changing, not individuals. You might want to jot that down. Evolution is not about individuals. It's about groups of populations. And as those populations change, or we have different genetic makeups in those populations, we can measure the rate of evolution. We'll get back to all that when we talk about through genetics here. But what we're talking about, I just want to make sure you understand, we're going to be talking about reproduction and variation, right? And variation is a source of variation, right? So, reproduction and variation are sources of creating new combinations that may allow for a population to evolve. If there's not enough variation in a generation, then when the environment changes, there may not be any survivors, and in fact the population will then be said to have gone extinct. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this variation and the reproduction. So what I'm going to do is remove that. If you didn't have it, go back and jot that down. But when we talk about reproduction, let's make a little diagram here that might help us. I'm sorry about that. Alright, so that might help us. So if we've got our idea of reproduction, which I hope you understand, which is really kind of like making new organisms, there are two major types of reproduction, and we're going to break them down into asexual and sexual. Right, and so we're going to kind of define what these two terms are and then use this to anchor some other content that I haven't mentioned yet that we need to know. But when we talk about the prefix of asexual, this A in front of sexual really just kind of means not. Right? So we have sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. And you might think you know what sexual reproduction means, but in a technical sense you may not. So what sexual reproduction simply means is that there are two different types of cells that combine to make a new individual, right? So I think you think you know what sexual reproduction means, and it requires males and females to reproduce for fertilization to occur for the next generation. And in our context, in human context, those are two separate individuals. But in other non-human organisms, remember we're talking about all types of living things, there are some organisms that have male and female cells. They have both. They have two different types of cells, and they can actually self-pollinate. So a flower that produces pollen and an ovule, pollen being the male cells, the equivalent of human sperm, and ovules or eggs, can actually self-fertilize or self-pollinate. And that is still sexual reproduction. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's considered sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction, which is really when there's one cell that essentially splits into other cells. And there's some plants, interestingly, that can do both, that sexually and asexually reproduce. And in some ways, we might qualify that we do both. To make it the next generation, you have to sexually reproduce, and you are a product of sexual reproduction, whereas your cells are asexually reproducing, but it's not technically a new organism unless you were to count each cell in your body as an organism. But that's not quite true because your cells depend on each other. So anyways, there are types of asexual and sexual reproduction. So let's break down the asexual into different types and apply some common terms. So you might have heard of the term cloning. There's something called budding. And there's another one that's really important that you need to know. We'll put a star next to it. It's called binary fission. Right? So fission means to split, and binary, it refers to two. And this is mostly what bacteria do most of the time. One cell will split into two. And so they make clones of themselves. But the process itself that it goes through is called binary fission. And you know of another process. So this is going to be really kind of like for prokaryotes. Hope you remember what prokaryotes are. If you don't, look that up in your notes. And then eukaryotes go through a different process. Most of our cells will go through mitosis. Do you remember PMAP, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase? You need to be able to describe what's going on with those chromosomes. We'll come back to chromosomes a little later today. Or a little later. I'm already looking at it almost at 9 minutes. And then there's sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is more of the process in which we've got these two different types of cells. Really, it's about the combo or the combination of sperm and egg. And so really, the sperm carry half the genetic information, the egg carries the other half, whereas in asexual reproduction, the parent cell has the same number of chromosomes as the daughter cells, and that's not the case here, right? So when these combine, 1/2 plus 1/2 gives you the whole number. And there are a couple other terms that we're going to talk a little bit about soon enough, and I'll just throw them out right now so that you can maybe look them up, and we can talk a little bit more about these haploids and diploids. And these sperm and these egg are made through another process called meiosis. And meiosis is one of the key processes that leads to variation, which again is critically important for our survival and natural selection. whereas bacteria don't rely a whole lot on this sexual reproduction, although they technically do a little bit of it, and we can ask me about it. We'll talk more about it in class. So if I forget to ask you, you ask me in class. But bacteria just kind of clone themselves, but they do rely on mutations for survival. They reproduce so quickly and so often that they inherit many mutations. Okay, so what we're going to talk a little bit about is this process right here, is the combination of the genetic material of sperm and egg, and that when they combine, we call that process fertilization. And what fertilization does is it produces a zygote, which you might have heard of before, which is going to be related to a few key terms that we're going to talk a little bit about. So let me just go over some quick history, and we will then do some vocab. Try to do that a little bit more quickly here. So there's one name, only one name, that is critically important for genetics, and you've heard of his name before. His name's Gregor Mendel. He's actually kind of controversial in the specific world of genetics, because his data was too good, and so some people think that he actually threw out some data to be more convincing, but the principles that he came up with still hold true for the most part, or some of the time. But Gregor Mendel is recognized as the father of genetics, of modern genetics. Okay? Father of genetics. And he was publishing his work, writing about his work in the 1860s. 1860s, a long time ago, not a long time ago, I don't know. That's about the time when we were fighting in a civil war in the United States. It's the same time that Darwin was publishing his work. It was 100 years before we knew about the double helix, right? So we knew about genetics, but we didn't know about DNA. So we'll talk a little bit more about what genetics actually is. But Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk, not Australian, but Austrian, in Europe, Austrian monk. And he was known for working with peas, right? So garden peas. And there were two reasons that he worked with peas that were incredibly important. So they reproduce very quickly, and they reproduce a lot, right? So quickly and abundantly. So think about just even one pea pod that you might eat. There's several peas inside of one pod. Each pea is a new zygote, is a new embryo. It's a new individual that was produced by an independent pollen and egg, or sperm and egg. And so what you can actually do, very interestingly, is from one combination of two parents, or from two parents, you can get lots and lots of data. And from that data, you can make predictions about the genetics of the parents. And that's all of what genetics is the ability to make predictions based off of that data. And that's what a Punnett square allows us to be able to model. So they were quick growing, they grew abundantly, and there's another term, is that they were true breeding. Which meant that in some ways that they were able to self-pollinate, and we could actually collect data pretty well, pretty quickly. And basically, true breeding is that it was self-pollinating. You could get the same traits out of a plant every time. So if I took a true breeding green pea plant, or a plant that gives me green peas, and self-pollinated it, or it self-pollinated, you continue to get green peas 100% of the time. Or a yellow pea plant would always give me yellow peas. And its offspring would give me yellow peas. And its offspring would give me yellow peas if it self-pollinated. And that was he was able to control data that way. Okay, so bear with me. I know I'm approaching 15 minutes. I want to go over a couple of terms with you. So what we're going to do is define a couple of these terms in the context of things that you know. And so let's see, what should I do here? I'm going to draw a line underneath all this, and define some of these terms, right? So some of the terms that we're going to talk about are going to be critically important for you to master, and master quickly. So much so that I'm going to actually make a Quizlet for you and send it to you in Google Classroom to help you practice some of these terms, right? So what genes, so genetics, right? Genetics is, I guess we should define genetics first, right? So this is the study of the inheritance of genetic material, or of, let's say, of DNA, right? So this is how we inherit DNA. It's not the study of DNA, it's the study of how we get DNA. And so it's all about passing stuff down. And so in this case, we need to have multiple generations. I hope you see the word gene in the word generation. It's very, very closely related in root. But what a gene is what we're going to label as a factor of inheritance, something that you get, right? A factor of inheritance passed down from generation to generation. But that factor of inheritance is really a chemical that produces, here's another word, traits. Okay? It produces traits. So, I have to break this down, right? I cannot let this go because you know a little bit about this. So a chemical that produces traits. So what we're really talking about here is DNA, right? That's that chemical that we're talking about. It's the passing of DNA from one generation to the next. It's the DNA is what creates traits. So in your notes from last year, at the end of the year, you should have something written as the central dogma of biology. And it should be this. DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is then translated into proteins. Well, DNA is that genetic material, and proteins are the traits. Okay? So proteins and traits are the same thing. And traits are things that we can very easily see, but as you know, and I hope you know, and hope that you review if you don't, is that protein isn't just something that we can see on the outside. Proteins also affect the rate of chemical reactions when they're enzymes. They affect the passage of molecules and ions in and out of cells when they're embedded in the cell membrane. They affect your muscle contractions. They affect the hormones they are the hormones that run through your blood. They do many, many things. They fight viruses and bacteria in the forms of antibodies. So there are lots and lots of things that these proteins do, but they're all coded for by this DNA. So it's critically important that we understand how we inherit that DNA from our parents. And it's not as straightforward as you think. So what we're going to do is kind of model a little bit of it, but what we need to do is define a few more terms. And I want you to really kind of think about this DNA, and I'm going to ask you in class to provide me multiple representations of it. In other words, I'm going to ask you to draw it in a few different ways that shows me that you can connect it. What does DNA look like? Or at least what are ways that we model DNA? There should be several representations that you have in your back pocket, or if you don't, you need to get it there by reviewing your notes from last year. Alright, so we've got genes. Let's talk a little bit about traits and what traits are. So traits are genetic characteristics, not preferences, genetic characteristics that that change between individuals. Okay? So you might have studied some kind of silly ones in middle school, like your widow's peak, your ability to roll your tongue, whether you have attached or detached or attached earlobes. That's all good and well. There are many more other kinds of traits we could be talking about, and we will talk about sickle cell anemia. We can talk about color blindness. We can talk about hemophilia. There are lots of different traits that are critically important, that aren't so obvious or frankly silly, that don't necessarily affect survival. But sometimes those traits come around because they happen to travel together in inheritance. And when I mean travel together, what I mean is like on a chromosome. Remember this X-shaped chromosome? Well, it's made up of hundreds and thousands of genes. So there are spots along this chromosome that we call genes, that are a section that code for a specific trait. And remember, this side is the sister chromatid. It was made during the S phase of the cell cycle, and it's an exact copy. But there might be a gene for something that's traveling with another one, and the other one is what has been selected for or chosen in nature by this changing environment and the competition that's leading to it. If there's another gene that happens to be traveling with it, basically it's traveling in the same car, then it's going to continue to appear as we move forward in time. But anyways, we've got traits, we've got alleles, which is another word that hopefully is a review word, but alleles, A-L-L-E-L-E-S, are different versions of a gene. So you might have heard that we have different genes. Well, we don't have different genes per se. We have the same genes. We have different versions of those genes, and that's what makes us unique. We have different alleles, and it's not that there are infinite types of genes or infinite alleles, and that's why there's so much variety in the human race or human species. Instead, it's the combination of the alleles that is so interesting, because alleles are for different genes, right? And sometimes we represent those alleles with like a capital letter or a lowercase letter. So you might remember those as dominant or recessive alleles, but rest assured that that's not as simple as just dominant and recessive. There are other types of alleles as well. And then we're going to use one more word right now, and that word is hybrid. And a hybrid is a combination of one or more forms of a trait. So it's a combo of two or more forms of a trait. So we'll get in a little bit more specifics of how we can interpret that word in this context. But I see I'm already at 23 minutes. I'm going to stop there, and I've barely done any vocab. I need you to understand those really well, and I'll see if I can continue on to another video here.